So tonight, reliability of the Gospels. So now we say there's a God. Okay, has he revealed himself? Has he caused anybody to write things down about what's going on there? So we'll talk about the Gospels and the resurrection of Jesus. Without these two things, we don't have Christianity. So reliability of the Gospels. They've come under a lot of attack, as you can guess. There's been a lot of hostility over the last 10, 20 years directed toward Christianity. People say, well, how do we know who wrote the Gospels? Just because the names are on the top there, who came up with that? Weren't they written long after the time of Jesus? That's a complaint. And wasn't it kind of a church deal? This is pretty much the Da Vinci Code approach, that the Gospels were kind of a power play by the people who got to power in the 300s, right? And they decided that Constantine had this big convention, council, and got together and they said, we'll take that one, we'll take that one, we'll take that one, but not these. And so it was kind of a church deal. So these are some of the complaints that you're going to hear about. So let's talk basics here. People who are in the field of looking at ancient manuscripts are going to judge them in two ways. So we'll just put the Christian documents, the New Testament documents, against the other documents that are out there. So how close are they to the original? Does that make sense that if you had a document that was within 5 years of the original document, you'd probably trust it more than a document that was 500 years later? You'd say, well, I don't know what happened in those 500 years. It could be completely different. So you want to judge, one way to judge is how close do you have as a document to the original. Oh, I went backward, there we go. And then the second one is, all right, now you got it fairly close, that's nice to know, but how many copies do you have? So I want you to imagine a little mind game here. So you got this favorite aunt of yours, and she's getting elderly, and she makes the best apple pie in the world. I mean, it's unbelievable apple pie. But she's getting pretty old, and people are begging for that recipe of the apple pie. And she takes the time to write out 2 recipes, hands them out to 2 of her favorites, and then she passes away. And the whole family gathers at the memorial, and they said, did you get the recipe? I don't have it. Do you have it? No, I don't have it. And then they find the 2 copies. Well, what if one says tablespoon, the other says teaspoon? One says 1 cup, the other one says 2 cups. You only got 2 copies. What if, though, on the other hand, that she'd done this like a dozen times because she had favorite people that kept asking her, so she writes it out? Is that better to have 10, 12, 20 copies? Wouldn't that be better? Because then if one said cup and the other said cups, 2 cups, you could check all the others and say, oh, she meant cups, because they're all saying cups, just this one is kind of off base. One says tablespoon, but all the rest of them are saying teaspoon. You go, okay, I would trust that one better. So that's what we're talking about, how many copies exist. The more copies, the more you can say, I'm guessing this is what the original was. So by the way, just in case, I don't know if this disturbs anybody, the Vatican doesn't have sitting on a shelf someplace the original Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Right? It's not sitting on on a wall somewhere or whatever. So we don't have these things. There's a great story. A guy goes to a monastery. This is a true story. He goes to a monastery in the Middle East. And this is back about, 7,500 years ago. I bet Tracy knows the story on this. So it's kind of cold that night, and some of the monks come in, and they're going to feed some documents, some old documents they don't want anymore. They're going to feed them into the fire to warm them up. And he goes, he starts looking at it, and he goes, don't burn these. These are like, copies of the Old Testament or New Testament or whatever. He's going, you gods, you guys are feeding these into the flames. So there's still documents to be found, though. There's still manuscripts to be found. The rumor right now is that they've got something from Mark, not the whole gospel, but a part of Mark that goes back really close to the 1st century. And so they're finding them all over the place. I heard that for people who died and they kind of mummified them or whatever and wrapped them around, they would use old strips of manuscripts and all that they didn't care about anymore. And some of those had been like glued together. In other words, they're like layers of them. And they're finding some things are not worth anything, but others are maybe New Testament things. So this is going on constantly. They keep finding more copies. Okay, so here are the 2 standards. Oh, shoot, that's pretty low. Sorry about that. So how far from the originals? Just take a look at Caesar. 50 BC, the first copy we've got, the first one, we don't have the original, is 950 years later. But guess what? Are the historians going to throw out everything about Caesar? No, they say, those people are pretty reasonable the way they copied things. We trust it. We think he really did this and he did that and he went into Gaul and did all that stuff. Plato is worse shape. That's 1100 years, right? But people don't say, well, let's not teach Plato anymore. They say, yeah, we think these are pretty close to whatever his original ideas were. Tacitus, Roman historian, 1,000 years. Homer's the best, right? Homer's the best. Something like 500 years, which doesn't sound too bad compared to all these others. I'm sorry it's down low here, but the New Testament, we're already picking up pieces of the New Testament within 50 years or so after the original writers were finished writing the New Testament. We have complete books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John around 200 something. And then the whole Bible, the whole New Testament is like in the 300s. So unbelievably close compared to all these others. I would take the Bible over the New Testament over any of these. What about this? How many manuscripts are out there? Okay, again, we're basing everything on Tacitus. We got 3 copies. That's it. There are no more. I mean, there may be some buried somewhere. We don't know, but that's it. We're basing everything we think about Tacitus on 3 documents. Livy 27, pretty good. Again, notice how Homer is doing pretty well here. Right, a lot of documents coming, a lot of manuscripts coming from Homer. New Testament, that's just in the Greek. Then you've got Latin. And then the thing that I think is really amazing is the church fathers who are really close. They're early 100s. So we're just talking 50 years or so after the Gospels. As they wrote their letters, and we've got them, and they would send them all over the kingdom, wherever they were, they'd say, well, as Mark said, and then they quote something from Mark. Well, as Matthew said, and they quote something from Matthew, and you start putting these together because they were really prolific. They were quoting and quoting and quoting. You can recreate almost the entire set of Gospels just from these church fathers. Michael.
So in J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, one of the highlights of his book is that he makes the early church fathers quite interesting.
Yeah.
We think of them as, who needs them?
Yeah.
But he has a concept of chain of command.
Yeah.
And he goes through and like Peter and his close associates, and further on other associates of them, and you can trace the writings and the thoughts of these of the original, like the disciples, through the early church fathers for like hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And there's like 3 or more separate chain of commands like that.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I'm going to actually have a slide to show that so you can see it. Yeah, as long as Michael brought this up, this is a really, really good book about the New Testament documents and all. It's a former cold case detective, if you don't know anything about J. Warner Wallace. He's come to our class, he's been at the church, and he was his dad called him an angry atheist. He said I was an atheist. And then he heard somebody say, Jesus was a pretty smart guy. You ought to read something about Jesus. So he said he bought a cheap Bible because he thought I'd probably throw it away. And he started jotting things down coming from a cold case detective approach. And he's going, good land. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are reading like eyewitnesses. And we can talk about that a little later. But this is an excellent book to get a hold of. All right, here's the big issue, right? This would be really important. Do we have eyewitness reporting? Yes. Or is it just, way down 200-300 years later? Well, it'd be nice, wouldn't it? Because it's going to be more accurate if the people were there, and there's no time for mythology to get worked into this. If you have somebody doing something 400 years, 500 years later, how do you know that other stories didn't kind of work their way into the originals? So we'll start with what's called internal evidence, if you just look at the documents themselves. So John, in the Gospel of John and 1 John, he says, I was there. We heard him, we've seen him, we've touched him. And he says, testifies, and he says, proclaiming. I mean, this is pretty serious. He's not just saying, oh, by the way, it's not casual. This is like a court of law saying, I swear to this. It's testifying. We get that in Peter as well. He says, we were eyewitnesses. Now, you don't have to believe it, but I'm just saying they're making that claim. So we can start there. They've made the claim. Here's some more internal evidence. Notice what Luke says. Luke says something a little different, doesn't he? This is from chapter 1. Is he claiming that he's an eyewitness? No. But what is he saying about the eyewitnesses?
He got it from the first.
They gave it to him. Here's my guess. He never says it anywhere, but if you read the first few chapters of Luke, he had to talk to Mary, don't you think? Because he got the Song of Mary and what she's thinking about and stuff like that. That just always gave me shivers. I mean, imagine him sitting down with the mother of Jesus. Wow. I wouldn't go anywhere for weeks, just cement myself right there to hear that. How about Paul? What does Paul say? He doesn't say he was an eyewitness. Well, he will in a second. But he says, for what I received, I passed on to you. So he's getting information. So that's his claim. He was not right there walking with Jesus, but he said, people gave me this information. Now he does say later on that Jesus appeared to him. So those are more internal things, right, just from the Gospels themselves. This is from J. Warner Wallace's book. He does his own sketches, which I think is interesting. Now, this one is I've got to back up through this thing because it looks kind of overwhelming just to see all these things going on here. But this is indirect proof. I think it's really good evidence for how early you want to date these Gospels. So you got to start over here on the right side. The temple gets destroyed. That was a huge deal to the Jews, wasn't it? I mean, that was their center of worship. And the Romans, pretty methodical people, they took it apart. The siege itself from 67 and 70 AD. So let me ask you, do any of the Gospels mention the siege or the destruction of the temple? No. Really? If you're going to write something in 80 or 90 or 100 AD or 200 AD, do you think it would be in there? Of course it would. We write now about 9/11 because we lived through it. But if you wrote before 9/11, you're not going to mention anything about 9/11. So it's pretty good evidence that everything in the Gospels and Acts and all would be prior to this because they would have mentioned it. Then the next thing that happens here is the loss of three of the disciples and all, Peter, James, and Paul. And we can date that early to mid-60s. Nobody doubts that. Every historian will nod and be okay with that. So let me ask you, let's stop there again for just a second. The book of Acts discusses the death of Stephen, yes?
Yeah.
Is he, I hate to, badmouth Stephen, but is he a huge deal in the church? Not compared to these three. So do you think if Luke spends a chapter like he does on the death of Stephen, do you think he would have spent some time if he knew the death of Peter or Paul or James? He would spend time on that, wouldn't he? I mean, if Stephen gets a chapter, are you kidding me? The death of Paul? But it's not in there. So most people say then Luke, in his book Acts, we're talking Acts at this point, because Acts is the second book that he wrote. So we're here now. He writes Acts without knowing these things, which I would guess is not ultimate proof, but I think you can make a case for happening in the late 50s for the book of Acts. Back up a little bit more. In one of Paul's earlier epistles, he quotes the book of Luke. You can only quote something if it's already out. So that means Luke's gospel has got to be over on the left further, correct? Closer to the time of Jesus. So we're talking, I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but we're talking maybe early 50s AD for the book of Luke. So why are we putting Mark even closer? Because everybody agrees Mark is earlier than Luke. Right? These are not made up things. This is what historians will agree with. So what does that get us? That gets us into the 40s AD. And Jesus is in the 30s. You're talking 10 years. You're not talking centuries. You're not talking generations and all. Here's some more evidence as far as what's going on. Do you know what I'm talking about when I mention creeds? Think of it like, a lot of places of business have mottos for their business or whatever. It's kind of like a condensed form of what they value, their philosophy. So creeds were kind of like that. The early Christians, they didn't have books at this time. They didn't have their gospels. So what are you going to do with a room full of new converts? You want them to remember who Jesus is. You want them to remember why he came and things like that. So you'd create a creed that might be a song or it might be a written document, real short, just for them to memorize so they knew what was going on. So this is one of the most famous ones. I gave you a little piece of it before. This is from 1 Corinthians. This is Paul. The way he puts it, he says, what I received, I pass on to you. That was Jewish talk for, I didn't come up with this, but people I trust gave it to me, and I'm going to give it to you. And this is in the 50s. You know what people are saying that have studied this creed, this is a creed, they said it doesn't sound like Pauline language. It sounds like earlier than that. Most people think some of these creeds that are in, by the way, they're all over the New Testament. It's not just Paul, so they're all over the place. Most people think this creed, this particular one about Jesus dying and coming back and appearing to all these people, within a year of the resurrection. And notice what it says. So this is actually earlier than the Gospels. And guess what? It doesn't contradict the Gospels at all. It's saying the same thing. So taking it back within a year, are you kidding me? I mean, I didn't know about this until just a few years back. Reading this, like, wow, really opened my eyes. Then we mentioned, this is what Michael talked about, the church fathers. People like Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, they all sat under each other. John was actually the teacher. Can you imagine sitting under John? Wow. So Ignatius and I put a line there because that was both of them. They both sat under John, and then they wrote about it and sent letters out and all this kind of stuff. Irenaeus sat under those two. So that's only one person removed from John. And this continues. I just kind of ran out of space here. But so is the story here any different than here? No. Is it any different than here? No. Is it any different than there? No. So they're keeping the same story all along. They're not saying, well, you know, John got kind of mixed up. This is really what happened. They don't do that. They keep saying, this is what happened. This is what the Gospels talked about. Peter has something like that continues. Mark, the Gospel writer Mark, sat under Peter and on and on and on. So these are chains of custodies that you can follow, and it takes you way back, again, to the time of eyewitnesses. How about church fathers? I'll go kind of quickly over this, but they agree that the four writers that we talk about today, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they didn't have anybody else in mind. They said, yep, those are the ones that did the writing of the four Gospels. There were never anybody else in contention, right? They didn't toss one out because they didn't like that person. This is it. They just said it's just four. They didn't have anybody else. And this is what I mentioned about them quoting from the New Testament. This is really early stuff in the 2nd century. How about some external evidence? In other words, okay, that's nice that it says something inside the gospel, but is there anything that connects the gospels to the rest of the world and the rest of history and culture and stuff going on? Well, just take Luke. He got so many things right that only a person who was there would know. I'll just give you one example. The leaders in the various cities would go by different terms. In other words, today in our country, you go, I don't know, small cities all over, and they'll always have a mayor. So, that makes it pretty easy, you know, city council, mayor. But cities back then were kind of like city-states. You know, they were pretty independent of each other, and they would have different terms for their leaders. And Luke would always get it right. He'd say, so-and-so Paul showed up and spoke to the whatever, and he'd have the right term there for that city. Well, people 300 or 400 years later wouldn't have known that because the cities were all changed and language changes and all, but he got it because he was 1st century. Here's a pretty well-known scholar, and he said Luke's history is unsurpassed. Pretty impressive, right? So here's somebody on the outside looking at what Luke said and said, he got it. He got it right. John does the same thing, by the way. I always like to use this example because I love it, because it seems to pull it right back into the 1st century. John said at the pool of Bethesda, when Jesus shows up there for the healings and people trying to get in the water and stuff, that there were 5 colonnades that surrounded this pool. And John was really specific, 5 colonnades. You know, like big columns there. And so, of course, the 70 AD, Jerusalem just gets smashed. Nobody knows what no colonnade is left standing. Everything's down. It's just a mess. It's rubble. And then centuries go by, and they start digging around, you know, like they've been doing. You've seen things they're doing in Israel. Guess how many colonnades they found? 5 colonnades, not 6, not 4, not 2. They found 5. So John seems to would have to be an eyewitness. You couldn't guess that. 100 years later, you look at Jerusalem's rubble, you go, I don't know how many colonnades are there. How about some non-Christians? Are they backing up anything here? Yeah, Josephus talks about Jesus, and he talks about his brother. He just kind of throws it off casually. He says, hey, you know, James, the brother of Jesus, he got put to death, blah, blah, blah. That's all he doesn't, it's like everybody knows that. So he just says, brother of Jesus. Wow. Pliny, a governor, writes about what the Christians were doing, treating Jesus like a god. Tacitus talks about Christ. Jewish Talmud, which is the writing, what would you say, interpretations of the Jewish scriptures and all, kind of their history. They talked about Jesus dying because he was a sorcerer, which I think is kind of interesting. Do you see what they're admitting? Mm-hmm. He did some really amazing things. They just credited it to the wrong source. You know, they said it was black magic, but they didn't say, oh, he's a nice guy, too bad, got put to death, what an idiot, he thought he was the Messiah. And they said, no, he's a sorcerer. So they're going, he was up to something while he was here on this earth.
With that kind of touches on one of the, they call it historiographical criteria to know that, yes, this is accurate, that one in particular is enemy attestation.
Yeah.
They say, you know, if your enemy admits it,
yeah,
it's probably true.
Yeah.
Other things are like principles of embarrassment.
Yeah.
And if it's embarrassing, you know, it's probably true because they're not going to put in an embarrassing
No,
detail.
you wouldn't create something that, you know, dismantles what you're up to. Here's what a lot of people worry about, though. They say, okay, so you're telling me that the Gospels didn't get written down for maybe a minimum of 20 years or 30 years. So what was going on before that? And it's oral tradition. People are sitting in their church services and saying, let's hear a story about Jesus. Well, at one time, and then they would tell, right? They would have these stories. So people go, I don't know about oral tradition. I'm a little leery about that. And they start thinking about that stupid game they played when they were a kid. You ever played telephone? You're in a circle and somebody starts a statement of some kind and it gets crazier and crazier because you whisper it in the next person's ear and it finally goes around. The last person says, here's what I heard, and everybody laughs because it's totally different. And they think, well, isn't that kind of what's going on here? And the answer is no. It's not like the telephone game at all. First of all, we are terrible at memorizing. I've had to put my phone number in the back of my cell phone. I hate to admit it, but people say, well, I'll call you back. What's your number? Hang on. So I'm terrible, but it's not just me, right? Most of us, we have our little electronic devices. We don't have to remember very much anymore. But back in those days, everything was oral. You had to memorize a ton. You know, there are Muslims today that memorize the Quran. It's roughly the size of the New Testament. Can you imagine sitting down and memorizing the New Testament, not just a verse, not just a chapter, right? Okay.
Barry, I work with people in a nonprofit that I serve with at the moment. And we work in Malawi, Africa, and the illiteracy rate there is very, very high, huge. And because it's such a poor country, part of that problem is the education.
Yeah.
And they memorize entire chapters of the Bible.
Wow.
As we bring the Word of God to them.
Wow.
And they'll stand, they love to perform because they have no other entertainment. So they'll stand up in front of everyone,
Yeah.
and somebody will do Luke chapter 2.
Wow.
And they'll just say it. So
Wow. That's
isn't that something
yeah.
still happening today?
Still going on, yeah. Here's the other difference. One of the other differences is Jesus wasn't whispering to somebody, hey, pass this on. I mean, this is public. He had a lot of people listening to him, so somebody could correct it if they didn't hear it right. And they would say, what was that? You know, and they'd say, here's what he said. Strong motivation to memorize. He's not giving you just a, how's the weather? Jesus is telling you stories of salvation. He's telling you what your soul is like. He's telling you how to get right with God. He's telling you how to deal with your fellow human beings. I mean, this is not stuff where you go, oh, that's nice. You know, it's like, no, really. I mean, he's talking to people that want to know the truth. So this is something where you'd lean in. You wouldn't just go, eh. By the way, I forgot up here, memorable ways. You ever notice Jesus does things that really catch your ear? He'll do parables, and parables are, I used to teach the Bible out of Palomar, and I'd say a parable is kind of like a trap door. You know, you're going along, you think everything's all right, and then Yeah, like the prodigal son. You know, you think, oh, what a happy ending, and then the older brother gets real snotty about the whole thing. Remember that one? And there, a lot of these parables are like that. It's like, whoops. How about the Good Samaritan? He didn't call it that. We label him, we go, isn't that nice, a Good Samaritan? Well, Jews hated Samaritans. So here come the good Jewish people by that guy who's down and out, and they go, ew, I'll get dirty, and they move on. And then Jesus says, and then a Samaritan came by, and the people probably went, ugh, he'll probably try to rob that guy another time, you know, but the Samaritan stops and just does all that stuff. The people must have said, what? What's going on here? Right? Trap door again. So he does that a lot with his stories. And the job of a disciple, whether it was Jesus or somebody, I mean, if you're latching on to a rabbi, what was your job? Listen and memorize what this person said. And then finally, some people are suggesting nowadays that there actually may have been some note-taking during that time, which would make things a lot easier. Here's another area where people get a little iffy and a little upset by. If you read the story of Jesus and the three temptations, if you read them in the different Gospels, you're going to get those temptations in a different order. Do you notice that? They're not in the same chronological order. Or if you hear when Jesus is being baptized, voice comes from heaven. And in one, I don't remember, it's Matthew and Mark, I can't remember which is which, but in one it says, this is my son, whom I'm well pleased. You know, listen to him. The other one says, you are my son, in whom I'm pleased. So people go, well, somebody got it wrong. Yeah, but we're thinking of modern history. Modern history is like tape recording, you know, put it out there and let's hear exactly what a person said. It was different back then. You didn't have to get the wording exactly right. It was okay to actually move your chronological stuff around so that it had some kind of impact. Right? You did it because it worked for whatever it was you were trying to say. And it was okay to summarize. You didn't have to have every single part of what the person was up to. And you didn't have to cover the whole life, which I know frustrates me, and I bet it did you too. You don't find out anything about Jesus till he's 12. Then you don't find out anything about Jesus till he's 30. It's like, wait a minute. The majority of his life is not there. And then the majority of the Gospels are just the last few weeks of his life. So you'd say nobody doing modern history would write it that way. Okay, but for them, you didn't have to cover that. You wanted to find out the character of the person, right? The character is what was important. So how do you demonstrate character? Well, for Jesus, it was facing that cross. And going ahead and doing this awful thing, but on our behalf. So, here we go again. Is this the Da Vinci Code? The later church is at work here. They're creating these stories of Jesus to make their church look okay. A bunch of reasons no. Jesus actually looks, I wouldn't use the word confused, but he doesn't seem to know everything. He doesn't know when he's coming back. If you're writing this in 300 or 400 AD, you want to elevate your guy, don't you? You want Jesus to be the Almighty and he knows everything and he's on top of everything. And he doesn't appear to be. He seems pretty human. And the disciples, are you kidding me? In 300 or 400 AD, don't you want to make Peter look good and John and all these? But Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And the disciples seem totally confused most of the time, don't they? And they're bickering about who's going to be better in the kingdom. I mean, I'm picturing Jesus walking around going, guys, I've been with you for 2 years. You're still doing this stuff. I'm with you all the way, says Peter. And then when Jesus is arrested, long gone. Jesus has hard sayings. If you're going to create this Jesus to be your model of the church in 300 or 400 AD, you wouldn't have him saying things like this, to hate father and mother. That doesn't work if you're going to just make up stuff. He doesn't say about things that were important in 300 or 400 AD. For example, nothing about church structure. You don't see Jesus saying, verily, verily, get yourself a bishop. Right? He doesn't do that kind of stuff. Nothing about food laws, nothing about circumcision, nothing about what to eat, what not to eat. Right? He doesn't do that kind of stuff. Because the people that wrote about him wrote in the first century. It wasn't 300 or 400 years later. The four Gospels are listed so early anyway. It's not like it went 300 years before they decided on Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We've already talked about that, right? The church fathers already said it was early. Okay, here comes another issue that people are a little concerned about. we got all these variants, they're called. They're differences because you look at manuscript A and you look at manuscript B, and it's maybe one verse has a slightly different wording to it, and people go, well, couldn't they get it right? What's going on here, right? We got all these differences. Some people estimate there are like 400,000 differences. They say there are more differences in their words in the New Testament. So everybody goes, oh great, we don't know anything about the New Testament. Yeah, but you know what they don't tell, I say they, Bart Ehrman is the main guy that's making a ton of money creating confusion and controversy and making you feel like you can't trust the Gospels. Most of these are spelling. Apparently they didn't spell much better than we do. A lot of them are synonyms, word order differences, and just weird stuff. Like in Greek, you can say the in front of a person's name. In some places they don't say it. And Dan Wallace says he's never figured it out, even though he studied Greek his whole life. He's a textual critic. He looks at these old documents. He says, I wrote a thesis on this. He said, I still don't understand why they put the. So if you're looking at two documents, and one says, Mary got up early, blah, 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 and the other one says, the Mary got up early, they're going to count that as a difference between the two. But do you see it doesn't make any difference? In some places it'll say Christ Jesus instead of Jesus Christ. That's counted as a difference. But does that matter? No. There are some that might make a difference, but they're really late. Everybody agrees, yeah, that's going down over a cliff here, but that wasn't the original at all. They can study these manuscripts. They're in families, groups, and they said, now, there are some differences, but they come hundreds of years later. And some actually do make a difference, but they don't alter the basic message. So you're going, where are these differences? Well, you know them. I'll give you just two. These are the two biggest ones. They call this the long ending of Mark. Your Bible will, you can go home and take a look at this. It'll say, when you get to verse 9, it'll say, the best manuscripts don't have 9 to, is it 30? 9 to 20. They don't have 9 to 20. Okay, but does that at the end there say, oh, by the way, Jesus never got resurrected? No. There's nothing in those verses that are going to make a difference one way or another. Here, I bet you know where the other one is. Without me putting it up there, do you know anything else that your Bibles will indicate not in the best manuscripts?
The story of the woman caught in adultery.
Yeah, exactly. So if you go to John 7:53, it's right at the end of John 7, goes into chapter 8, and it'll say right there. People know these things, but Bart Ehrman brings them out in his books, and people go, oh, I didn't know that, because they don't read their Bibles, so they look at it and they go, well, what else is going on? Well, he picked the two biggest, and there are a couple of others that just like a word here, a word there. Now, let me ask you this thing about Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. Is that going to change your faith if that is not really part of the New Testament? What difference does it make? A lot of people think this really happened, but some later person writing or copying the manuscript said, gee, I wish I was in there because that was a great story, and they just plugged it in. So we don't know for sure, but anyway, so these are the big areas, but so what? What about other Gospels? You've been hearing things about the Gnostic Gospels? Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, all this kind of stuff. People say, well, how come they're not in there? Is that, again, the church looking at some saying, nah, and are they just doing that? So in 1945, in a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt, they came across these Gnostic Gospels. Gnosticism is kind of a philosophy that we don't need to worry about that now. And they were dated 300 to 400 years after the time of Jesus. And you got this one that a lot of people latched onto. Is called the Gospel of Thomas, and some people call it the fifth gospel. Don't do that. It's not alongside the other four Gospels. I'll explain here in just a second. So are they in a par with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Oh no. They're a lot later. Just because it's called the Gospel of Thomas, Thomas was dead 300 years or so before this got written. It's just using his name. It wasn't widespread. It wasn't found all over the place. That was one of the reasons they picked the books they did when the church council started meeting, is what books are being read all over the place that everybody's getting something useful out of them. That didn't happen with these Gospels. They had really odd teachings. One says, how can women go to heaven? And Jesus says, I'll turn them into men. Yeah. You can do it. You just type in Gospel of Thomas on the internet. Do a Google search, and you can. It doesn't look like the Gospels at all. It's just sayings, just 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's like 110 sayings or something. But look them up. They're really weird. They sound kind of New Agey. You got Jesus kind of right? He's sort of off on a separate planet with this secret knowledge. You go, I wonder what he meant.
Gary, there's also, we know about the Apocrypha, Old Testament Apocrypha that was shown in the exhibit. We had leaves in there of the Old Testament, but there's also a New Testament Apocrypha, and it's a gathering of books that have really strange names, and it's also very, very strange. I mean, you really need to have a strong faith to read these scriptures, because it talks about, one thing, it talks about Jesus turning insects into animals when he was a child.
He took clay and turned them into birds.
Yes,
Yeah.
clay into birds, and all those really strange
He
things.
killed a kid and brought him back to life. Did you know that?
Yeah, all this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's really, it's amazing how much is out there that they want to consider manuscripts that were used somehow within the faith.
Yeah.
But those...
But they're all so late. They were all...
so late, and
Yeah.
not just that, but they were really weeded out well through the
Yeah.
different conferences that were held to do that.
Yeah, they were never held among the church fathers as, hey, you ought to read this. This is good stuff. They always say, don't read it. You know, it's just trash. They were rejected by the church fathers. Remember, they were taught by the disciples through that chain of custody, and they looked at these and they said, no.
It's trash.
Yeah. Here's a final thought, and I didn't put the person's name. I will in just a second. But he says the oldest and best sources we have for knowing about the life of Jesus are the four Gospels. It's not the view of Christian historians, the view of all serious historians of antiquity, from evangelicals to hardcore atheists. This is Bart Ehrman. I thought Bart Ehrman was trying to undermine Christian faith. Yeah, but he's honest enough that he still puts stuff like this out there. So he's got two faces, right? When you really pin him down, all of these variants, that he loves to throw that out. 400,000 variants, you can't trust any of this stuff. And then he says stuff like this. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but this is Bart Ehrman. Anybody have we'll go to the resurrection in just a second here. Anybody have a thought or question or concern? I'll send you the outline. It'll have a lot more information than what we're doing tonight. We're kind of hustling through it.
Another thing to keep in mind is that when the church was copying scripture, they were super painstaking about it. They didn't just, have some guy in the back room writing down stuff. It was a system. It was an art and science.
Yeah, they would count the spaces on the line, how many letters would be in the space, and they would wear certain clothing that was honoring to God, and if they made a mistake anywhere, they threw the whole thing away and started over, and they didn't just blot it out or anything. Yeah, it was an act of worship. It wasn't just a job, it was serious stuff. Okay, so let's take a look at the resurrection of Jesus. We'll do what's called the minimal of facts approach, which Tracy is going to be doing with a Sunday morning class. There's a man named Gary Habermas, and he's got a book out with Mike Lacona. This is probably the best single book about the resurrection of Jesus. It's not hard to read. And I'm just going to be covering some of it. I just don't have the time. You can see fairly thick, but don't let that drive you off. It's Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Really excellent. So what he's done, he's decided, well, I could argue what the Gospels say and this and that, but he said, why don't I look at what historians, all historians, not just pro-Christian historians. So he's got atheists, he's got skeptics, he's got people sitting on the fence, and he's got Christians, and he's read more than anybody that I can think of about the resurrection. What do other scholars say? And he said he's going to come up with things that the scholars agree on. Start there, and then show you why the resurrection works as the best explanation for these minimal facts. So these won't be all the facts that you and I might believe, but he's just saying here's what historians buy into. So what's the data that's being granted? Oh, here they are. They're actually, Tracy was saying there's another one, but because of time, I'm just going to do these four. There are probably a couple more as well. But one is, historians agree that Jesus died. Okay, he died on a cross. If the Romans get a hold of you, you're going to die, if that's their plan. Number two, notice what it says here. It doesn't say the disciples did see him. Remember, these are people who, some of them, the historians, they don't buy into the resurrection. but they will agree that the disciples thought that they saw Jesus. And you'll see that this is going to actually play into our side of this issue in just a minute. A third is the tomb was empty. And Tracy was pointing out that probably not quite as many historians buy into this, but still a vast majority think this is the case. And then number 4, the conversion of Paul and James. Okay, so we can just take these 4 and we can make an amazing case for why the resurrection is the best way to answer or to work with these 4 facts. By the way, disciples believed they saw him. They claimed that. Remember we read some of that? The creeds have it in there. That chain of custody we talked about. And the fact that they were willing to die. Nobody dies for a lie if you know it's a lie. But let's go through these. So the tomb was empty. Okay. Preaching in Jerusalem started right after the death of Jesus. If he's still in the grave and they start preaching it in Jerusalem, they go get the body. Right? I mean, it'd be really easy for me to go to, I don't know, someplace in South America and tell you I saw a resurrection in Escondido, because people there are going to go, I don't know, we're hundreds of miles away, how do I know? But if I'm sitting here in Escondido and I'm saying I saw a resurrection and I'm telling you where the tomb is, you might take a spade, right? Go see if I'm making this stuff up. Early critics accused the disciples of stealing the body. Why would they have to say that? Because there ain't no body there, right? Nobody's there. Women are first witnesses. This is that embarrassment, right? Criteria of embarrassment. Why would you let women be the ones? They had a low status in that society. And the tomb never got venerated. Tombs for Jewish rabbis, people that were admired, they were venerated. People would go there on a certain day, you know, maybe once a year, and honor that person. But they didn't do that with Jesus. There's no story about that because the tomb wasn't important for Jesus. It didn't keep him. Paul and James were early converts. Paul's the persecutor. He had no interest in being a Christian. James was a skeptic. He's part of the family, and he's part of the ones that were saying, we have a brother who's nuts. Right? It took him a long time to come around. And they both get martyred for their faith. Okay, so let's deal with some alternate theories. So what I did was I took these 4 things and I just put them on a couple of pieces of paper so you guys could remember what they were. So Jesus didn't exist. Well, we don't even need to use those because there are no historians that buy into this. You know, Jesus is a myth, really? We got manuscript evidence, we got the creeds, we got the chain of custody, all the sources, historians agree. That's not going to be a problem. Let's go here. Women went to the wrong tomb. Number 1 still is in play, isn't it? I mean, that's not the problem. Do you see any problem with 2, 3, or 4 as far as women went to the wrong tomb?
It would explain 3, but it doesn't explain 2 or 4.
Well, you can't get away with 3, though. If the women went to the wrong tomb and he's in the tomb, they just redirect everybody to that tomb, right? So it's like, okay, that doesn't work very well. Yeah, would that explain, are you saying, Tracy, number 4?
Yeah, it doesn't explain.
Doesn't explain number 4, does it? So what if they went to the wrong tomb? Why would that make Paul and James become Christians? That makes no sense. What would that have to do with the disciples thinking they saw Jesus? That doesn't seem to work either, right? So you take those facts and you say, oh, that doesn't work. Right? Disciples thought they saw him. The tomb was empty. The conversion of that minimal fact can't explain this if you're buying into this alternate theory, right? The facts are slapping you in the face. So that's out. Jesus just swooned. This is a popular theory about 50 years ago. Jesus just swooned. Any of these minimal facts cause that one to be really suspicious?
The first one, obviously.
Yeah. He died. The Romans got a hold of him. You think the Romans were that stupid they couldn't put somebody to death? That was their job. If they don't put him to death, guess who's going to die next? You know, the person who's supposed to carry it out.
If he
Bridget?
just swam, then he didn't need a tomb.
Yeah, wouldn't need a tomb.
So there was,
I guess you could work with number 2, though, right? The disciples thought they saw him. But here's the deal. The guy comes dragging himself back to your group, your disciple group. He's got the bandages still half done. He's oozing blood everywhere. Comes crawling over, and they go, You're the Son of God. No, they say, you are one lucky guy. Right? Nobody's going to go out and die for this guy. They're just going to say, you dodged a bullet. That doesn't make any sense. Would that have anything to do with the conversion of these two guys, Paul and James? Are they going to convert because he was able to get off the cross? Yeah. Anyway, so that doesn't work very well. Would you worship him? You just say, good for you. It'd take him months to recover, I would think. Especially when you think about what happened to him. Even before being on the cross there, that scourging that killed people. It just tore the skin apart. Anyway, awful stuff. There was a switch. This is what Islam believes. There's another person on the cross. There's an old switcheroo. Okay. Any of these contradict that?
Doesn't explain the conversion of Paul or James.
Yeah, it doesn't explain does it, the conversion of those two? You think the disciples, they thought they saw him? I guess that would work if somebody else is up there, so you're probably all right on that one.
But what about John being there? I mean, I don't recognize this guy on the cross. I've been with him for 3 years.
Yeah.
He's got to be his twin brother.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they believe that there might have been some supernatural effect where, God supernaturally changed the appearance of somebody else to look like Jesus, and that someone else was crucified, and everyone just thought it was Jesus because he looked like him.
Yeah.
And didn't it say that they couldn't even recognize who he was?
You mean after the
So
beating?
badly
Yeah.
beaten, So maybe they're justifying why he was so badly beaten, nobody could even recognize who he was. It wasn't Jesus, it was somebody else. So that's why they're justifying that.
It's not part of what I have here, but one thing that always struck me is about the Muslims. They're writing this stuff in 600 or 6-something AD. I'll take the New Testament writers way closer to the events than somebody 600 years later saying, here's what really happened, folks. Really? You know 600 years previous?
And the motivation from that comes from their theology, that it's a presupposition. God would not have his prophet be degraded like that. And so they presume God wouldn't allow his prophet to go through that. Therefore, he couldn't have been crucified.
So they need an alternate,
So where
right?
was Jesus in the interim?
Yeah, so what happened to him?
And how did he get away from the Romans?
Yeah, you'd have to keep a low profile
He had
after
to
that.
really
right?
keep a low profile.
Yeah. Well, then the minimal facts mess with that. I mean, it's possible, right? There's a difference between something being possible and something being reasonable. I mean, it's possible that a meteor is going to hit us in 30 seconds and wipe us all out. I mean, it's possible. It's not reasonable. But, yeah, Dave?
Well, the irony is, there was kind of a switch. It was supposed to be Barabbas, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, good point.
Instead of switched out.
I always wished that somewhere in the Bible that told us the story of Barabbas afterwards.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be interesting? I mean, did he think about that? Wow, this guy died for me. I mean, it seems like he'd kind of want to know something about this guy that died in your...
I wrote a play about it once.
Oh, you did?
I'll talk to you about it sometime.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a short novel just called Barabbas by a Swedish guy. So, yeah. How about this one? The disciples hallucinated, right? So that would certainly take care of two. Right? That's... Oops, I'm wrong there. So that, that ties into two. Disciples thought they saw him. It's just an hallucination. Do any of the other facts cause a problem for that view? If they're hallucinating, hello, you still have a tomb with a body.
That's right, real deal.
How about number 4? They hallucinate. Why would Paul hallucinate a guy that he thought was ruining the Jewish faith? Why would James hallucinate that? He didn't buy into what Jesus was. So you got problems with those as well. So I'll go quickly over it. Oh, by the way, there's no such thing as group hallucinations. I mean, really, individuals have them, but not groups. I mean, if we sat here right now and say, let's hallucinate. I mean, everybody'd have something different, right? The disciples probably stole the body. Okay, we got any problems with Any of these?
2.
Number 2, that's right. If they're in on it, they know that what they're going to go die for is a lie. We're back to that problem. Like, why would you willingly get beat up and lose all your friends and stuff? And yeah, so to explain the empty tomb, but how about number 4? Why would Paul be so shaken to change his entire life? I mean, he was a Jew of Jews. He was up at the top. He had the best education, and he was going to go places. And he said, it's all like trash to me. Well, something happened bigger than a stealing of a body. Conspiracies fall apart, by the way, don't they? This is what Chuck Colson talked about. He was part of the Watergate thing. He said, yeah, people can't keep a secret for a week. And these guys are all in on this thing, and then nobody spilled the beans and said anything. And why would you do that? So you're the disciples, and you grab the body and you pretend that Jesus is the Messiah. What are you doing it for? Impressing the opposite sex? For money? Fame and power? This is what J. Warner Wallace said. He said most crimes fit into one of these 3 categories. He said, what did the disciples get out of it? Pain, rejection, death.
Persecution.
Yeah, persecution, being tossed out of the Jewish community. I mean, that was really important to a Jew. All of that's gone. So what did they get out of it? Why would you do that? What's the point? Yeah, I'd like to have a lot of punishment in my life. Nobody volunteers for that. I guess the biggest, if you really come down to it, the biggest concern, and then Wallace talked about this, it's the fact that we're dealing with a miracle. So if you start with a presupposition saying, well, miracles can't happen, then you got to go to one of those other theories. But if you say, hey, look, there's at least a possibility that miracles could happen. If so, now the resurrection's back in play. But I think we can actually make a pretty good case for miracles. We're actually going to spend more time on this, it's either next week or the week after, because people still struggle with the idea of miracles. Really? Walking on water? Mm-hmm. Talking snakes? Mm-hmm. Arcs? Okay. So, but if there's a God, which I think most people are okay with that, but they've just opened the door, haven't they, to the possibility of miracles? Because God exists in a separate dimension. He brought the world into existence. So at least you got the possibility of strange things happening if there's a God beyond this world. The Bible, you look at the Bible and the way it's put together so cleverly and carefully, at least it's possible miracles, it seems to suggest that. Our lives. Again, if we had tons of time, I'd love to hear. I bet you've got stories of either people you know or yourself that you've had a legitimate miracle of some kind. There's a little book out that I love. It's called Signs and Wonders in America Today. And it's just story after story, and they tell you the place, and they tell you the people's names, and the things that happen. My jaw just drops. Because I'm kind of a hard-nosed person. Sometimes, it's just me, but I think, does that stuff still happen? Yeah, it does. Craig Keener put out a 2-volume book. It's just huge, both volumes. It's just called Miracles. And he's got stories from around the world of miracles that have happened, including his own sister-in-law. Reports from others, Keener's book is something that you ought to take a look at sometime. Even science, and we'll talk about this more whenever we talk about miracles. So this is a way to reason. It's called an inference to the best explanation. The fancy word is abductive reasoning, which nobody needs to worry about, but we haven't proved it in the sense of scientifically proven, we haven't put it in a test tube, but if you take all these things that we're talking about and you make the best guess possible, since we weren't there and everything's coming to us from somebody else. So given just these 4 facts, and we can add more, but anyway, let's stick with those. This is the best assumption, that Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm glad.